I want to thank you for joining me as we dissect yet another critical moment in global political economy, a moment not just of change but of deep systemic reckoning. The headlines this week read, U.S. faces backlash, Venezuela power shift shakes Washington. And while the corporate media may reduce this to yet another leftist surge or foreign policy dilemma, I want us to take a deeper look historically, economically, and ideologically at what this truly represents. Because let's be clear, what's happening in Venezuela is not just a localized power shift. It's a challenge to the global architecture of U.S. elite capitalism, and Washington is feeling the tremors. For decades now, the United States has treated Latin America, Venezuela included, as its economic backyard. Whether it was the Monroe Doctrine or the thinly veiled interventions of the 20th century, Washington has operated with a simple rule. If a government in Latin America prioritizes its own people over U.S. corporate interests, it must be destabilized. That's exactly what happened to Venezuela. Once one of the richest nations in Latin America due to its oil reserves, Venezuela became a target the moment it sought to redirect oil wealth away from private profits and toward public programs, from Hugo Chavez to Nicolas Maduro. The country attempted, in its flawed but determined way, to build a system that redistributed wealth, expanded health care, subsidized food, and reduced poverty. Was it perfect? No. But it dared to step outside the rules of neoliberal orthodoxy. And for that, it was punished with sanctions, sabotage, and international isolation. And yet here we are. Despite everything, the people of Venezuela have brought forth a new power shift-explained political shift, one that signals continued resistance to U.S. dominance in the region. This is what Washington fears. Not Venezuela's military power, but its defiance, not its economy, but its example. If a country under crippling sanctions can still push back against neoliberalism and assert national sovereignty, what does that say to the rest of the global South? What does that say to the working classes here in the United States? Let's dig even deeper. Why is there backlash in Washington? Why the hand-wringing? Because a fundamental assumption of U.S. foreign policy is being shaken that resources in the global South should serve us, not them. Venezuela asserting control over its oil wealth and redefining power relations within its society directly threatens that logic. It challenges the very heart of capitalist imperialism, and you'll notice suddenly the language shifts. Now it's about human rights, electoral legitimacy, and regional stability. But where was all this concern when U.S.-backed dictatorships ran rampant through Latin America in the 70s and 80s? Where were the sanctions when neoliberal governments gutted public services and handed entire economies to foreign corporations? The real story is this. The global monopoly the U.S. once enjoyed is eroding not just economically, but ideologically. More nations are turning to multipolarity, to China to be braced to alternative models in Washington. It's scrambling to maintain a position that was never just about freedom or democracy, but about markets, labor exploitation, and control of resources. The recent political transition in Venezuela is more than a domestic reshuffling of leadership. It represents a bold defiance of decades of U.S. hegemony in Latin America. For those paying close attention, this is not an isolated incident. It is a symptom of a growing and coordinated resistance to a world order long dominated by U.S. economic and political interests. Venezuela, once branded a failed state by Western media and portrayed as a cautionary tale against socialism, is now reemerging as a symbol of sovereign resilience. And that development, unsurprisingly, is shaking nerves in Washington. What has unfolded in Caracas over the past weeks is not just about a transfer of political power, but about the rejection of a model the United States has attempted to enforce across the region since the early 20th century. For too long, U.S. foreign policy in Latin America has functioned under a basic and unspoken assumption that governments south of the border should remain pliable, economically open to American Washington's response and concerns corporations, and politically aligned with neoliberal orthodoxy. Any deviation, be it land reform, nationalization of industry, or efforts to redirect wealth toward public services, has been met with swift backlash, be it through sanctions, coup attempts, or diplomatic isolation. But this time the backlash is moving in the opposite direction. The new political leadership in Venezuela has not only maintained but doubled down on its rejection of U.S. tutelage. Instead of backing down under pressure, it is leaning into policies that assert national control over key industries, particularly oil, and seeking stronger alliances with countries that offer alternatives to U.S. influence, including China, Russia, and members of the BRICS coalition. That this is happening despite years of crushing economic sanctions speaks volumes. Not only has the U.S. failed to achieve regime change, but it has also inadvertently strengthened anti-imperialist sentiment both within Venezuela and across much of the global South. This is precisely why Washington is concerned. The threat Venezuela poses to U.S. interests is not military, it is ideological. It poses the question that no empire wants its subjects to ask, what if we don't need them? What if we can survive, even thrive outside of their system? The reality is the United States has invested considerable effort and resources into ensuring that countries like Venezuela remain within its sphere of influence. This includes covert operations, economic coercion, and heavy media manipulation to maintain the narrative of a humanitarian crisis brought on solely by socialism. But that narrative is cracking. Increasingly, international observers, economists, and even former allies of the U.S. are beginning to recognize the role sanctions and external meddling have played in Venezuela's economic hardship. In other words, the script is flipping. What's happening now in Venezuela serves as a warning sign to U.S. policymakers who have long relied on outdated models of control. This is not the 1960s, and the Monroe Doctrine is no longer a blank check. The political will among Latin American nations to resist U.S. domination is growing, and Venezuela is once again at the forefront of that movement. Its leadership is not only refusing to fold under pressure, but is actively working to build an alternative economic and diplomatic future, one where sovereignty is prioritized over compliance. For the United States, this signals a loss of leverage and credibility in a region it once took for granted. And perhaps even more troubling for Washington elites, it sets a precedent. If Venezuela can defy economic sanctions and impact U.S. pressure and regain political and economic footing, then why not Bolivia or Argentina or any number of other nations worthy of Washington's demands? That question is not just rhetorical. It is the beginning of a broader geopolitical shift that may prove far more consequential than any one election or policy change. This is what keeps policymakers up at night. Not just that Venezuela is moving forward, but that it's doing so without asking Washington for permission. The political shift underway in Venezuela is not just a regional event. It has sent ripples through the halls of power in Washington, exposing long-held anxieties within the U.S. foreign policy establishment. While the American public is often fed a sanitized version of international affairs, one that reduces foreign developments to mere policy disagreements or ideological clashes, the reality beneath the surface is far more systemic. What is unfolding is a crisis of authority, a visible crack in the fast aid of U.S. global dominance. Venezuela's bold political realignment is not simply an internal change. It is a direct challenge to the legitimacy and reach of U.S. influence in the hemisphere. For much of the last century, the United States has operated on the assumption that Latin America is part of its strategic backyard. Embedded in this assumption is a belief that Washington has the right, not the privilege, but the right to shape the political and economic destinies of countries across the region. This belief has been institutionalized through military alliances, intelligence operations, trade deals, and most insidiously financial control mechanisms such as debt dependency and sanctions. When a country like Venezuela breaks from that mold, when it refuses to submit to externally dictated economic policies or resists regime-engineered leadership transitions, it is perceived not as a sovereign act, but as a threat to the existing order. The reaction from Washington, therefore, is not just about Venezuela. It is about what Venezuela represents, a refusal to play by the rules that the U.S. has long set for others, but refuses to follow itself. This is why policymakers and think tanks are sounding alarms. The power shift in Venezuela is not viewed as an isolated incident. It is being interpreted as part of a broader, more alarming trend, the erosion of U.S. credibility and control in an increasingly multipolar world. At the heart of this anxiety lies a contradiction that U.S. officials are unwilling or perhaps unable to confront. On one hand, they continue to espouse the language of democracy, human rights, and self-determination. Global alliances forming on the other, they consistently undermine those very principles when a nation's democratic choices conflict with American economic or strategic interests. The United States did not object to democracy in Venezuela when the elected government aligned with its interests. But when that same electorate chose leaders who challenged the dominance of U.S. oil corporations, redistributed wealth, and pursued alliances outside the Western Bloc, suddenly democracy became a problem to be solved. The power shift in Venezuela also reflects a larger recalibration occurring globally. Countries once dependent on U.S. aid or fearful of U.S. retaliation are beginning to explore alternative partnerships. Economic, diplomatic, and even military, China, Russia, and other rising powers have offered support to nations seeking autonomy from the West. Venezuela's pivot toward these relationships further underscores Washington's declining influence not only in Latin America, but across the global South. In this context, Venezuela is not alone. It is part of a growing bloc of nations pushing back against the one-size-fits-all model of neoliberal capitalism promoted by the United States since the end of World War II. The backlash in Washington is as much psychological as it is strategic. It marks the loss of something intangible yet foundational control over the narrative. For decades, U.S. foreign policy has relied on a carefully curated public perception, one in which the U.S. is the stabilizer, the liberator, the benevolent global leader. But that narrative is breaking down, especially among younger generations and across emerging global movements that see American interventionism not as a force for good, but as a mechanism for exploitation. Venezuela's recent political developments confront the United States with a reality it can no longer ignore. The world is changing and Washington's grip is slipping. The reaction from the U.S. is not merely concern. It is a sign of desperation, because once a nation dares to step outside the orbit of American influence and still manages to survive, the backlash against U.S. policy's illusion of indispensability begins to shatter. And that more than any election or speech is what truly shakes Washington. The long-standing U.S. strategy of economic warfare against Venezuela, particularly through sanctions, was designed with a singular goal to bring the country to its knees and force regime change. Yet, after years of relentless pressure, the outcome has not aligned with Washington's expectations. Rather than collapsing into chaos and capitulating to foreign demands, Venezuela has adapted, reorganized, and is now showing signs not just of endurance, but of political recalibration. This failure of sanctions to achieve their intended purpose has caused quiet panic in Washington and sparked louder questions around the efficacy and ethics of course of economic policy. Sanctions, though often marketed as a peaceful alternative to war, have long functioned as tools of economic strangulation. They are not neutral. They target the population as a way of destabilizing the state, inflicting suffering with the hope that internal dissent will weaken or overthrow the leadership. In Venezuela's case, these measures were justified under the guise of punishing corruption, defending democracy, and protecting human rights. But the real motive was no secret: to unseat a government that dared to defy U.S. economic and geopolitical dominance in the region. The outcome, however, has been deeply paradoxical. Yes, the Venezuelan economy has suffered significantly. Hyperinflation, food shortages, and a healthcare crisis were all exacerbated by sanctions that restricted access to vital imports and cut the country off from global financial systems. But rather than discrediting the government, these hardships, widely seen by many Venezuelans as foreign-imposed, fueled nationalist sentiment and strengthened the narrative of resistance. The government, in turn, was forced to shift strategy, forming new alliances and reshaping domestic policy in ways that have made it more adaptable and less dependent on traditional Western markets. The hook here, the uncomfortable truth, is that the U.S. sanctions policy has not only failed, but has arguably strengthened the very forces it aimed to destroy. What Washington underestimated was the capacity of a state, especially one with considerable natural resources and a politically engaged population, to reorganize itself under pressure. When barred from Western financial systems, Venezuela pivoted to alternative banking networks. When oil exports were declining, U.S. influence in Latin America sanctioned, it sought new markets through bilateral agreements, barter systems, and discounted sales to non-aligned states. These shifts have not undone the damage, but they have laid the foundation for a different kind of resilience, one that doesn't revolve around U.S. approval. Equally striking is how the sanctions have backfired diplomatically. In the eyes of much of the global South, Venezuela is no longer merely a country in crisis. It is a symbol of imperial overreach and survival. While Washington accuses the Venezuelan leadership of authoritarianism, more nations are beginning to question who the real aggressor is. When economic tools are used to induce hunger and collapse, the narrative of humanitarian concern begins to falter when juxtaposed with the intentional blocking of medicine, food, and fuel. In this environment, U.S. policymakers now find themselves in a credibility trap. They cannot easily lift sanctions without admitting policy failure, yet maintaining them only deepens the humanitarian toll and exposes the strategic futility of their actions. Moreover, other nations are watching. If sanctions on Venezuela can be resisted, if they can be survived and even leveraged into political strength, then the U.S. loses one of its most powerful instruments of control. This is not just a Venezuelan story. It is part of a broader reckoning with the limits of American power. When sanctions no longer produce submission, when governments learn to pivot, adapt, and even reassert sovereignty under siege, the architecture of U.S. global dominance begins to creak. Venezuela's survival in the face of coordinated economic warfare is not an anomaly. It is a warning. And the real shock in Washington isn't that Venezuela is still standing, it's that it may have learned how to stand stronger without them. What makes Venezuela's current direction particularly unsettling for Washington is not merely the political leadership in charge or the alliances it's forging abroad. It is the economic model that media narratives realities continues to challenge the dominant global ideology. At the heart of the backlash from U.S. officials lies an ideological discomfort. Venezuela, despite its hardships, refuses to fully embrace neoliberal capitalism. Instead, it remains committed, however imperfectly, to a set of economic principles that prioritize national sovereignty as redistribution and state intervention. In the eyes of U.S. elites, this is not just an alternative model, it's an outright provocation. For decades, the United States has promoted the neoliberal economic framework as the only legitimate path to prosperity. Deregulation, privatization, free markets, and minimal state interference have been sold not merely as policy choices, but as economic law, immutable, universal, and non-negotiable. Countries that accepted this model, often under the pressures of international financial institutions like the IMF and World Bank, were rewarded with access to credit, investment, and diplomatic favor. Those that rejected it, however, were treated as rogue states, isolated, destabilized, and in some cases directly targeted for regime change. Venezuela's refusal to fully submit to this order is a source of profound ideological friction. Under both Hugo Chavez and Nicolás Maduro, the country pursued policies that redirected oil wealth toward public welfare programs, expanded social services, subsidized food and housing, and strengthened labor protections. While these efforts have been subject to internal mismanagement and external economic shocks, they nevertheless represent a clear deviation from the USA-backed model of corporate-driven development. That alone made Venezuela a target, not because its economy was a key takeaways from Wolff threat in terms of scale, but because it threatened to demonstrate that a different path was possible. This is where the real anxiety in Washington originates. If Venezuela, with its vast oil reserves and strategic regional influence, can maintain an alternative economic direction, particularly one that centers the needs of its own population rather than foreign investors, then the credibility of the neoliberal order itself begins to erode. And credibility is everything. The global capitalist system is held together not just by banks, treaties, and military power, but by the belief that there is no viable alternative. Venezuela's persistence, even in weakened form, chips away at that belief. There is also a deeper irony here that is difficult to ignore. The very policies that have been most criticized by Western analysts, state control over key industries, price controls, subsidies, and strategic planning, are now being revisited globally in the wake of crises like the COVID-19 pandemic, rising inflation, and environmental instability. Even within the advanced capitalist countries, There is growing skepticism about the unregulated market as a solution to social problems. Meanwhile, Venezuela is being punished for policies that in some form or another are reappearing in the very economies that once condemned them. Venezuela's continued commitment to state-guided development, especially in the face of immense economic pressure, functions as a form of ideological resistance, and ideological resistance is dangerous to empire. It cannot be bombed, sanctioned, or easily overthrown. It spreads through example, through inspiration, through the idea that sovereignty can include not just borders and flags, but control over economic life. That is the lesson Venezuela continues to offer. Not that it has perfected an economic alternative, but that it insists on one. In a world where inequality is skyrocketing and disillusionment with final thoughts and conclusion capitalist systems is intensifying, the demand for alternatives is not going away. Venezuela's example, though often dismissed as irrelevant or extreme, stands as a reminder that economics is not neutral. It is a terrain of struggle, a battleground over values, priorities, and power. And when a nation as strategically important as Venezuela chooses to fight that battle outside the rules written in Washington, it is not only disobedience, it is defiance with consequences. It is